The best way to focus on yield is to buy something that's got good fundamentals, good capital growth potential with a good underlying land value, but with minimal value on the improvements.
Our motto is buy without regrets, and so
if you can buy a property that will serve you for 10 years as opposed to 3 years, that will serve you well. It's something.
Buying a great property today, that's not just what it's about. It's also getting something that could be ripe for improvement when the time is right for that investor or for the next buyer.
You think about, right, lifestyle, what's important to you? How do you get to work? What do you need for your family? What amenities like parks and shops? Then you look at the budget.
Welcome to Street Secrets. I'm Chris Bates. I'm a mortgage broker since 2013. And in this podcast, we're going to be interviewing Australia's leading buyer's agents, ones with decades of experience, have the local insider knowledge on the street, and can really help you with your buying process, no matter whether you're a first-home buyer, upgrader, investor. In this podcast, you'll get access to Australia's leading buyer's agents' minds every week on a Thursday. What's the word on the street? Welcome to Street Secrets. I'm Chris Bates, and in the studio today with Jarrod McCabe from Wakelin. Thank you so much for joining me, Jarrod.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Jarrod, look, we've known each other for a long time. We've worked with a number of clients for many years and really respect what you and the broader Wakelin's team do. But for people who don't know you, I mean, can we give you just a quick background on how long you've been a buyer's agent, what you were doing before you became a buyer's agent, and how's it all going, really?
Going well. I'll give you a bit of a quick background on our business. Richard Wakelin started our business back in March 1995, so we had our 30-year anniversary this year, which was great. From my own personal perspective, I did a university degree, Bachelor of Business in Property, and became a valuer for 10 years in a variety, mostly residential valuations, but I was in a regional area, so typically when you're in regional valuations, you're a bit of a jack of all trades, so we did a lot of rural and commercial industrial as well. Then moved to Melbourne and did purely residential valuations here, and then got into advocacy and advisory 15 years ago. So it was 2010 when I started. So about 25, or a bit over 25 years in property in general.
I do like the whole Richard Wakelin story. He's probably one of the godfathers of the buyer's agency world. I'm not sure if you'd be happy for me to say that. But I mean, he's 1995, right? It's the same as mortgage broking. Back in the day, I think it was would have been 1 or 2% market share then. And I mean, people wouldn't even know what a buyer's agent is. A lot of people don't even know in 2025, how it really works. I mean, what's it like working with him, and how has that really helped you in your journey?
Oh, it's been amazing. I mean, as you said, so he started the business in 95. The market was pretty ordinary at that stage. So to try and convince people to pay someone, which just wasn't the done thing at the time, pay someone to help them buy property just was a very strange concept. So to be able to do that in a time when the market wasn't strong either, and from what he tells me, the stories from back then, it was very busy from the very start. And then the market started to kick around 1997 when it really started to build. And obviously there was some really strong growth for a 10-year period up to the GFC from there on. He's amazing, Richard. His knowledge of property is unbelievable. His knowledge of people is really strong as well. Probably the biggest thing that I've taken away from him has been his negotiation skills and the way he goes about negotiation and the way he goes about representing his clients. He's got a rod of steel for a spine, Richard. He's unbelievable when it comes to negotiating, and I've seen some great results over the years with him.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, if you haven't ever read one of his articles in the AFR, they're always quality, by the way, and hats off. And there's always great insights, not just so much on a property level. It's more the psychology behind the market, which he's always seems to have a finger on the pulse. I mean, you've come from an investment focus buyer's agents. I mean, there's been a lot of this coming out in the last few years about investment focused buyer's agents, buying borderless and all that sort of stuff. But I guess he's had that same investment focus within the Melbourne market, when there's been a lot of other people buying the Melbourne market, like the units and the off the plan market, and we all know how they've performed. But has he kept the same fundamentals? I mean, you've worked with him for 15 years, but has it been the same fundamentals that have sort of stood the test of time, and he just constantly just focuses on?
Yeah, they have. There's been expansions in terms of locations and reasoning, and he likes to see a proven track record of things showing performance as opposed to trying to predict hotspots and what might be another growth corridor. He likes to see a proven track record, and the fundamentals of what makes a good investment property haven't changed. So the focus has been purely on usually period style homes in locations where scarcity values at a premium, lands at a premium, and focusing on properties that really attract multifaceted demand so that you're not not just reliant on investors, and which has been fairly sound, particularly in Melbourne over the past sort of 6 or 7 years, where the market hasn't been overly strong, and investors certainly haven't been a big player in that marketplace. But properties in the right areas had some form of growth, even though a lot of the market hasn't done a lot over that period.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about this, because I think it's an interesting, when you've entered as a buyer's agent, you've only been doing it for a year or two, and it's not to say you shouldn't ever enter an industry, but it just takes a long time, I feel, to get the runs on the board, because it's, it's a fewer number of transactions and you're starting out, it's always harder. And I've been doing it 15 years, seeing obviously a massive boom market in Melbourne in the 2012 to 2017 or whatever it might have been, and then having the COVID times and then coming out of COVID. What's some of the things that I think you've learnt and the things that have sort of stood the test of time through that more challenging period?
Yeah, look, it's been a really, really different time in Melbourne's market, and particularly, say, the apartment market in Melbourne, even from an established perspective, it's been different from some of the capital cities around town. I mean, there's been so much constructed in Melbourne from that sort of 2010 timeframe through till about the start of the pandemic, that 10-year timeframe. There was a huge amount of apartments constructed in the inner city areas. South Yarra is a very different skyline from what it was in the early 2000s, the sort of 2007, 8, 9 timeframe. A former colleague of mine took an interesting photo at one stage from an apartment in St Kilda Road, looking back at South Yarra, and then 10 years later went to this same apartment from an inspection perspective and took the same photo. And the difference of what South Yarra looked like, it's like a mini village. And there's a few of those around Melbourne now with the amount of construction that's occurred. I mean, even Box Hill, there's a lot out that way. And then even around Doncaster and Shopping Town, there's a bit going on there too. So the amount of, it's not just in the inner city where there's been a huge amount of construction. So that's had a pretty big influence on the apartment market. And it's had a flow-on effect even to the older style. So you go up to, say, Sydney, and from my discussions with you and obviously with Veronica Morgan and things around what's happened up there, apartments are still going reasonably well up there. And there's been some really good levels of growth. I mean, I've spoke to a client in recent times who we bought a really good house in Carlton North for that performed extremely well for the first 6 or 7 years. And then the last 6 or 7, it hasn't done as much. Still growing, but not to the same level. And over the last 6 or 7 years, the growth that a colleague of theirs had on an apartment in Double Bay had just dwarfed this fantastic house in Carlton North in Melbourne. And so over an extended period of time, you're just starting to see the changes. And so it's understanding what's driving that and understanding why you focus on certain areas and what's causing that performance or lack of in certain markets.
Yeah, I mean, the Melbourne market is an interesting one, right? I mean, you have had pretty relaxed planning controls. And naturally, I think while there might not be much building in the last few years, developers can't make money. A lot of them going under. They're putting their resources in other things and can't even get workers. They're going on government projects, etc. But there will be naturally another building boom down there, and it will change. The city will have to change. It's one of the great cities in Australia to live in. Obviously, there's been a heat on Melbourne in the last 3 to 6 months. And I don't want this podcast to be about what's happening in the market today, but more when you've got Melbourne getting to the mat where it's getting to a point where it's on the fundamentals looking like one of the better bets around the country, because it's probably been a laggard over the last few years. Where do you think that a lot of these buyers agents that often are coming into Melbourne without that sort of longer track record are really struggling to know what the locals really want and what will protect their investors long term?
You talk about investing without borders, and that's absolutely fine from the actual investor's perspective, but the person providing the advice needs to have an intimate understanding of where they're choosing to invest. And go back to Richard, and he could have picked up his philosophy and his approach to investing and put it into Brisbane or into Sydney or into Perth at any point in time over the past 30 years. But he knows Melbourne, and he knows Melbourne intimately, and he knows where to buy and what works and doesn't. So to be able to say you'd buy in this suburb, but you need to buy in this street, but don't buy on that side of the street and don't buy in that block. And if with the database that our business has got that's been developed over the past 30 years, to be able to go back and look at the performance of certain properties and the performance and how certain apartment blocks have presented and whether or not they've changed, that experience you can't get from looking up and looking at statistics online in terms of knowing whether or not a property's performed and whether or not it's been well maintained, well looked after over a long period. So the knowledge, I think, and the experience, and that's where the difficulty comes in for someone entering the market if you're just doing it off your own bat. And that's what we've probably seen a lot of in the buying industry, is that there's a lot of one-man bands, and they're not necessarily coming from an experienced position either. They're coming from a variety of locations, whether it's a former real estate agent, but a lot of the times it's not. A lot of the times it's coming out of finance industry or coming out of some form of corporate background. It's a little bit tighter now, but for a while there, it was a 1-week real estate agent's course, and you were able to go and hang up your buyer service and off you go.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of heat on trying to take advantage of buying under the 5% deposit scheme and trying to buy more around the median price in capital cities and more affordable investment properties. And just watching it from the outside, as it's pushing people into probably the parts of Melbourne that have got probably some of the least scarcity. You know, there's lots of land available. There's lots of new house and land packages, or it's on the fringe suburbs. I mean, it's how sort of the Wakelin approach differ to sort of that.
Well, that's one of the biggest issues with Melbourne from an investment perspective, and just from a property perspective, is the urban sprawl, because there's just so much land available on the outskirts. And you can go, apart from heading south where the bay is, but you can go pretty much in every other direction and there's land available. There's, apart from out in the eastern suburbs where the Dandenong Ranges hit, every other direction, there's just more and more land. So that's part of the problem. And going out into those land release locations, as soon as demand remotely gets close to meeting supply, there's more that comes available, and off we go again. And so until the infrastructure really kicks into place and starts to support those locations, and it's a gradual thing, but it's certainly not keeping up with the amount of subdivisions that are being put into place. So it's not something that we would look at. We look very much, I mentioned before about some of the aspects, but the three key fundamentals that we look for from an investment perspective are having something that's got scarcity value, which obviously those land releases don't, having something that's got a strong underlying land component. Again, when you've got land making up a much smaller percentage of your overall purchase, but also when there's more land available, it's not exactly a premium location. And then the third component is having something that's going to be suitable from a multifaceted buyer profile. So you want something that first home buyers will look at, that downsizers will look at, that upsizers will look at, and that investors will. And a lot of the accommodation that's being constructed in the outer suburbs is purely targeted at first home buyers. And so that's where they want to be. It's not as suitable for an investor because most people that are living out in those locations, the objective is to buy your own home. That's what they want to do. So the demand from a rental point of view is you might get a rental return to start with, but the vacancy periods in some of those properties can be quite extensive as well.
When investors come to you and they sort of talk about, I want something a bit higher yield, I'm willing to let go a bit of growth, they sort of go in there with an idea that they just need to get as high rent as possible. And the challenges in doing so in Melbourne, it has got a bit of a lower yield typically than other cities. How do you sort of reframe investors' view on the importance of actually getting an asset that's likely to grow in value?
We talk about what drives capital growth and what drives rental yield, and we talk about the fact that typically they work at cross purposes. Most of the time from a yield perspective, the yield is driven by the improvements, and the improvements, if you've got high yielding property, most of the time it's a riskier asset too. That's why you've got it at a higher yield. You can look at any form of investment, whether it's property or other asset classes, and the higher the yield, typically the riskier the asset. Whereas the lower the yield with a higher land component, you typically find that's going to be in the bluest of blue chip suburbs. And then you've got to get the balance right. The best property in terms of capital growth is most likely going to be, just purely capital growth, is going to be a vacant block, because that's where the land is what's going to appreciate. So if you're tipping all of your investment into the land, that's where the growth will come from. But that's obviously not going to help you from a yield perspective. And you do need to have some form of rental return because you need to be able to maintain them. So then you need to get the balance right in terms of the proportion of land component of the overall capital value of the property. So we talk to clients about the fact that the higher the yield, the higher the building component typically of the property. The best way to focus on yield is to buy something that's got good fundamentals, good capital growth potential with a good underlying land value, but with minimal value on the improvements, and then add value and then improve the yield that way yourself, because you can then lift your yield, but you've still got fundamentally a property that's going to give you good levels of growth. So if yield's important, that's the best way to focus on it and the best way to achieve it.
So Melbourne, there's obviously lots of parts to it, and I don't want to talk negative towards certain parts, but there would absolutely be fundamentals and pockets that don't tick your boxes. I mean, could you highlight maybe some areas that are, in your mind, the danger zones that you really try to steer clients away from, even in the, say the inner 10K ring of Melbourne? Is there certain pockets you don't like for certain reasons?
The easy answer to that is there's probably 0 to 2K radius of the city, because that's where you get the Docklands, the Southbank, St Kilda Road, those sorts of locations. So that's the simple answer. And then obviously those high rises I mentioned before in South Yarra. But there's always pockets within suburbs too. So we can go to the best pockets, best suburbs in Melbourne, and there's still going to be areas that you're going to avoid. Some of the highest land value areas in Melbourne are in Stonington, but there's still some pretty large housing commission developments in those sorts of areas. And we want to give those a little bit of space in terms of capital growth, because because from a marketability perspective, they're not typically the strongest in terms of growth areas, and they're not certainly the strongest in terms of demand for those locations. So you can be in a blue chip suburb, but you can still be in the wrong part of that suburb. So it's a matter of understanding, again, what works in a certain suburb, but what doesn't. And so understanding that's really important.
Yeah, it's kind of what the locals want within that sort of community and what they'll pay for, really. And when there are in that suburb, or that part of the suburb that's kind of their forever home, right? And the turnover's lower. But there's some parts of suburbs. Can you pick a sort of suburb where, it's really challenged a certain part? I mean, when I've invested in Melbourne before or helped clients on some pockets have got trains and trams and rat runs and lots of different issues. And are they the kind of the fundamentals, or a bit of a long walk to public transport? Some pockets have got dark zones.
That was going to be my point. Exactly what you said there was, so you can have some fantastic suburbs, and some of the more middle ring type 10 to 12k radius type locations in Melbourne, because of the way Melbourne's public transport system works, it does fan out. So the further you get out, the bigger the gaps are between where you can get to those public transport linkages. As an example, you can be in suburbs like Camberwell and Surrey Hills, which are really well-regarded owner-occupier type locations. But from an investor's perspective, they can be quite isolated in certain pockets. So being relatively close to Union Station, or being closer into Burke Road where Camberwell Station is, and not being too far out in those isolated pockets can be really important. You can go to other areas and understanding, like I said before, what the fundamentals are of what people want and expect. So using, say, Fitzroy as an example, Fitzroy is a fantastic inner city suburb that's really, really popular. There's good pockets and there's bad pockets, as is always. But what people expect or are prepared to accept in Fitzroy is very different from, say, a suburb like Hawthorn. So in Fitzroy, you can go in there and people love the pub culture and the cafe culture, and there are a lot of inner city pubs, local pubs, which are more like the English version, where it's nice and quiet, but people go there on a Saturday, Sunday, have a pub meal, have a few drinks and then head home. But being close to a pub's absolutely sought after in Fitzroy. Go to Hawthorn, and if you're too close to a pub, it's going to be shunned, and people don't want that. They want the distance. So understanding what the market wants in a certain location is vital to understanding how a property is going to perform.
Before I ask you around the value of buyer's agents, there's a lot of change going on, particularly in Sydney right now, a fight with the state government around zoning changes and trying to really increase the overall supply of dwellings in the city to stop the brain drain, the talent drain that's leaving, and a lot of the other issues it creates. I mean, how's the sort of Melbourne going to evolve, do you feel, over the next couple of decades as population's likely to still expand dramatically?
I mean, there's been a lot of talk of that with the Victorian government as well, around the growth areas in and around, and they're trying to create almost hubs around the suburbs to really increase development in there. And there's been a lot of pushback, obviously, from particularly in certain suburbs around Melbourne where they don't want the high-rise or the medium-rise developments in their suburban locations. But there's certainly been encouragement in that. You talked earlier yourself about the increase in construction, which will have to come back at some stage. But we need some growth in pricing from the apartment market, because at the moment, part of the issue is the sale price that is going to be achieved on some of these apartments when they're constructed is just not justifying the cost to build. So we need to see some growth in the established property. And that's not necessarily just the older style Art Decos and 50s, 60s, 70s. That's something in the high rise as well, because developers aren't going to construct new properties if they can't make a profit out of it. And at the moment, the construction costs, because the price hasn't gone up for a considerable amount of time in Melbourne, is holding it back and preventing a lot of things from coming out of the ground. So at some point in time, that will have to switch, and hopefully there'll be we'll start to see some growth. And we're expecting that to probably be into next year, that there'll start to be a bit of a turnaround. And part of that is being driven by what we're observing from an inquiry level, particularly from interstate investors at the moment. We're seeing a lot of that coming into our market, and hopefully that confidence, because a lot of the interstate investors have had a far more positive experience around property over the past 6 or 7 years, because there's been good levels of growth, whether they've owned investment properties or whether it's just building equity in their own home, but they've seen it work well and how it can be advantageous. Whereas a lot of local Victorians feel as though everything's negative around property and everything's hard work. And even though they've owned property and it's done well for them in the past, they look at it now and say, well, it hasn't done anything for the past few years and now it's just costing me more and more money. So the mindset's very different.
Yeah, do you think that'll naturally flip though? Investors got recency bias like we all do, and all of a sudden you start to see some decent numbers on the board and the media get behind it. And is there a lot of pent up wealth within Melbourne that can get unlocked because people are saying, well, I can't put more money into my super. I still need to do something for my retirement. Can't afford to upgrade to a bigger home. And so you're unlocking not only into Australian-wide investors, but you're also going to unlock a lot of the Melburnians wanting to invest in their own city as returns come back.
I think they're just been burnt, Chris, in recent times. So I think it's going to be driven by it from an interstate perspective. But I think once they do see some positivity there and they do see some return on investment and the market starts to shift, I agree with you, it will start to come back. But I just don't think that's going to be driven by locals because I think they do feel a bit burnt in recent times.
Melbourne has always had a lot of people never left Melbourne and they, from different states, moved to Melbourne. The mojo, I guess, they had prior COVID. And I think when you look at Brisbane and even you look at Sydney as well, there's an affordability benefit of buying a house in Melbourne. You're starting to see Melbourne starting to see that as quite good value. I mean, incomes have gone up, property prices haven't gone up, and as rates go down, there's a desire to potentially, well, actually, maybe we should upgrade our home, and that's coming back into the market.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing from an interstate perspective, people are seeing value in Melbourne. It's just not sitting where it traditionally has sat on the national scale. And that's part of the draw card, I think, that for why people are coming in. They do see value. They see that you can buy houses within 10 to 12 Ks of the city for around $1 million or early ones anyway. So there's good value to be had with housing in and around that sort of inner to middle ring suburbs. And I think people are seeing that and the opportunities are definitely there.
I've worked with lots of buyers agents for a long time, and it's always a hard conversation sometimes having a conversation with a client around the value that buyers agents add to someone's journey. A lot of them have rightly got, level one thinking, I guess I call it, where they're just thinking, access to off markets, or if they can't get me that, then what's the point? But after clients have worked with buyers agents, there's always these little sort of snippets of information they get. That was really a difference maker for me in actually getting the deal done. So can you give us an example of just where you see the value of what you do versus what consumers see the value is and what some of those gaps?
A lot of clients or prospective clients that come in, the first thing they think of is exactly as you said, the off market. The second thing is, are you going to save me money on the negotiation? They're the two most common things that people expect. And they're probably two of the things that are down the pecking order from what we focus on. The biggest thing that we focus on from our client's perspective is asset selection, is getting the right property. We can buy a property for the best price possible. We can buy something for you off market. But if we buy the wrong property, whether it's a home or whether it's an investment, it doesn't matter how well you buy it, it's not going to work. So getting the right asset for the right purpose is really, really important. And I think asset selection is a key part to selecting the right person to represent you. So if you've got key aspects, and it's having someone that then is prepared to tell you that's the wrong property, that it's not right for what reason, and to explain why it's the wrong property, so that they then do have confidence. And being prepared to walk away from a buyer's perspective and from a buyer agent's perspective gives a huge amount of credibility. And I've seen it a number of times, well, many, many times over my career, where I've said to clients, look, you just shouldn't be buying this property. Particularly the first time you say it to someone, it's almost a bit of shock. Well, but I love it. Why wouldn't I buy this? Well, you shouldn't buy for these reasons, A, B, C, D. And when they haven't thought of that, they've missed something, or not necessarily even missed it, but haven't understood the importance of certain aspects of it. And when you clarify that for them, it can be like a light bulb moment as well.
Coincidentally, I've actually got a call with a client who you actually helped buy for in Melbourne a couple of years ago. And I remember that client's story, really. I mean, you did sort of take a little bit longer than typical buyers agents would, but you end up getting an amazing asset on a great street, a period home in a premium suburb. And it was a top quality asset. And I think one of the reasons you got that is that you were patient. I think some of the other options they were considering weren't as good from an asset quality point of view. And I mean, I bought for a benefit of the market wasn't running that hot, so you could be patient, and it's probably one of the challenges. But I do find some buyers agents get trigger happy, and they're willing just to get the deal done to get clients off the books. But I think that patience game and really saying no to properties is highly valuable, because clients are going to hold properties for a long time, and maybe waiting a month or two is a better option than buying an asset just for the sake of it.
Yeah, being patient is an absolutely key part. And it's one of the first things we'll say to clients, because then that's another question that's regularly asked is, how long is this going to take? It's always, how long's a piece of string? And it depends upon, again, the purpose. If it's a home and they've got very particular criteria and very specific requirements, well, then it can take a really long time. But from an investment perspective, it's more about what the supply's like at any particular time, and then making sure that we hit the right targets in terms of prospects for growth.
You mentioned, Richard's negotiation skills early on in the podcast. Is there a sort of philosophy that you have in-house? Is there a way that you try to approach it that gives you an advantage you feel that you've learned over the years?
There's a lot of different ways. And I mean, when it comes to negotiation, particularly on, say, a private sale and expression of interest, I think one of the key things is to understand the agent's approach to things, because every agent handles things differently. There'll be different methods of negotiation. There'll be different methods of engaging with other buyers that have shown interest in a property. So understanding the rules of engagement with each individual agent, and it can't just be, oh, well, I've dealt with this agency before, I know they do this, because the next agent, and I've seen it so many times where different agents within the same agency will handle things very differently. I spoke to an agent on a property that I'm working on the other day, and this gentleman's only been with this agency for about 6 to 9 months. He's been in the industry for a long time, but with this particular agency, and he said to me, look, I'm still having difficulty with how the rest of the office handle negotiations because I do it in a particular way, and the rest of his office doesn't do it that way. So he's still working through. So understanding what the negotiation process is going to look like. But one of the big things that Richard probably instilled and talked about from this time I started here is silence can be your best friend when you're negotiating, and having the ability to say nothing can really work in your favour, which is not an easy thing to do. And particularly from a young buyer's advocate perspective, as someone who doesn't have the experience, to be able to just sit there and have silence for 10, 15, 20 seconds, it can seem like a lifetime, but it can have a huge impact on the way the negotiation might play out as well.
I think that's why I'm a very bad negotiator myself. I find it hard to stay silent. But I mean, you do highlight some really good points around the agent dynamics here. And Richard's been buying there for 30 years. You know, there's doing a podcast after this in an area of Australia where buyers agents haven't typically been there as part of the market. So it's a very established, you know, premium property market that's, you know, whether it's the auction capital of the world. And the buyers agents have been a big part of that market for a long time. And agents have, you know, they are very aware of working with buyers agents for many years. You know, when you've been one of them around for a long time, does that give you an unfair advantage? Do you feel, well, a fair advantage in some ways, but then, you know, a new buyers agent entering and the agency just goes, oh, there's another one here. And they know that they can still run rings around them a little bit because they're still learning how to do what they're doing.
I think one of the really interesting facts I remember when I first started working here, and with the way our business has been set up for the whole period, is that you never let out on your own early days. You are working side by side with Richard, or it was with Paul in the past, and with Monique as well. So I was never just sent out to do my own thing. I was to cover the market in different times. And so you go out and look at properties and report back, that sort of thing. But I remember one of the first weekends that I went out to look at properties on a Saturday by myself, and I went to the first open for inspection and walked in and gave my card, my Wakelin Property Advisory card over, and the agent, who I'd never met in my life, said to me, oh, Jarrod, yeah, you're from Wakelins. No problems at all. Come in. Well, I saw you at such and such. We'd never met. But because I had the Wakelin Property Advisory stamp on my card, instant credibility. That's not just from our business's perspective. Yes, we've been around for 30 years. There's plenty of other buying services around that would have the same instant credibility, but there's a hell of a lot more that people look at and say, I don't know who this person is. I had a real estate agent recently ring me and say, I'm going to send a buyer through to you who needs some help because they don't know what they're doing. And he said to me, this client came through and said that they'd been dealing with a buyer's advocate. He said, I'd never heard of this person. This guy had been around for just as long as I have been, possibly longer. He'd never heard of this advocate in the area. And he's been working in the Stonington precinct for 15, 20 years. So there's a respect there, and it doesn't mean that they're going to go easy on you. In fact, it's probably the opposite, but there's an understanding that they know you're going to represent the client to the best of your ability.
So when you've seen not just buying there, I mean, all of the properties you've bought, I think there's all the properties you haven't bought, all the properties you've seen on Domain and real estate and all the off markets you've gone to. When you think about your career, do you feel like you're a much better buyer's agent than you were 10 years ago? What are some of the things you spot today that you maybe wouldn't have spotted 5, 10 years ago, where that real experience is sort of showed, oh, maybe I do need to just double check the roof, or maybe I do need to just really look over that back fence and check out this issue that I've seen before? Like, what are some of the points that experiences really helps you be better?
You're learning every day. And I think part of the way that we work very much as a team is that yes, I've been doing it for just as long as Jordan Telfer in our office has been doing it for just as long as I have, perhaps even longer. But we have a very specific approach of covering the market very much as a team. So it's not just me that goes out and covers the market. We like to have 2 team members look at a property so that if someone misses something, the next person picks it up. And it's not necessarily because one person's more experienced than the other. It's because people see things differently. And so having that different vision of things, and it might be that, well, I can't see how we could upgrade this property or make it into a suitable, and someone else walks through and says, yes, you could do this, this and this. And then we have multiple team meetings a week to go over that sort of thing. So the team approach with the experience that we've got really adds value from that side of things. But there's plenty of things that I wouldn't have noticed when I was younger. For instance, single fronted cottages and terraces, walking through the front section. And if it's something that's, say, a 30-odd year old, and you've got concrete slab in the hallway in the front 2 bedrooms. Now, terrace houses didn't have concrete slabs put in them. So someone's had to go in there and tip a concrete slab into a property that was designed to, yes, it sits low to the ground, but it was designed to have ventilation going through it. The brick walls weren't built with concrete slabs in mind to be infilling in. So it's potentially going to lead to huge amounts of moisture issues within the brick walls. So understanding that's something that I would have just thought, that's a slab walking through, there's no problems with that. Now, understanding why you wouldn't want to buy something like that now, unless it's been basically a full rebuild, and not many of them have been. So there's bits like that. There can be looking at zoning issues and looking at neighbouring uses that you may not have been as concerned about in the past. It's hard to put your finger on one thing, Chris, because there's just so much that you gain knowledge of. It's not like going to university and just ticking boxes. It's the experiences that you get over an extended period of time, and the experiences that you get from your colleagues as well. So things that they've learned or that they've seen and have happened to them that you then can take on board yourself.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always like to, when I meet a buyer's agent, get to know them and their life story a little bit, not always all the way back to birth, but what were they doing prior to becoming buyer's agent? Coming from the evaluators' backgrounds, it's an interesting one, and I don't think there's a right or wrong how you have to come into the industry. I think there's skills in every profession often, but how's that sort of helped you, do you feel, just that sort of property knowledge in terms of the approach you went through from a valuer? Yeah,
it was interesting. To start with, it was probably almost a negative, because valuers approached valuers approach assessing property values from a very conservative perspective, because it's drilled into you from day dot that the bank needs to be able to get the money back at that price that you put on it. So if you're going to assess the property's value at $1 million, you need to know that the bank's going to be able to sell it at that tomorrow. Whereas if I value a property on that basis from a buying perspective, I'm going to keep missing properties time after time. But there's a balancing act there, because obviously we don't want to be overpaying either from a buying point of view. So you've got to be able to take into account the property's technical value. And I think that's probably what helped from a valuations perspective. But then being in the industry and learning from Richard and from Paul and from Monique and from others that were in our business, understanding what market sentiment is and how market sentiment influences values and how market sentiment influences auction results, and how you have to take that into account when assessing values. So the valuations gave me a really good understanding of how to assess property value, but there was then next levels that came into play from a marketing point of view, from a buying side of things.
We spoke about some of the negatives of certain pockets within certain suburbs, and some of the things I think you learn over time, that this is obviously the more desirable part of the suburb and it's worth, if I can, trying to get into. But there's a lot of things that people will really pay for in Melbourne. I mean, it's a pretty cold winter down there. The north rear is pretty nice versus being on the south facing at the back. I mean, a lot of people even get that wrong. I mean, the listing says north facing when it's, obviously south facing to the rear. But the frontage is just such a big part of the social dynamic that as you do well, you want this beautiful streetscape. I mean, other cities in Australia be like, what are you guys on about? What are some of the other things that you can think of that just Melburnians just really want and desire and will pay for?
One of the big things is accessibility to parklands. I mean, we were known as the Garden State for a long time, but accessibility to parklands and to outdoor space is a really big one. Public transport is important as well, but it's probably more important in certain cities than others. I mean, I did my uni degree over in Adelaide, and at that time in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, public transport wasn't a big thing in Adelaide, whereas it was probably developed more over recent times. But the other thing is the local village is really important within Melbourne, and having the access to that type of thing. That cosmopolitan lifestyle that Melbourne's well known for has really pushed out into the suburbs and created very strong community and village feels. And so having good access to that, people, particularly from an investment point of view, want to be able to have their tenants be able to walk to that sort of a facility. And a lot of owner-occupiers would prefer that as well, particularly when you get into the downsizing market. They don't want to have to be jumping in cars and things. So to be able to walk to a local village is really important. So that's a big driver in and around Melbourne. One of the interesting things, though, you talked before about the north facing, and I think that's a big thing, but I think sometimes people forget particularly when you're looking at the single front terrace and cottage market, which obviously from an investment point of view, we do quite a bit. The north facing rear is probably not the ideal orientation in that regard, in the sense that your biggest elevation with that type of property is actually going to be along the side. So if you can get a property that's more east-west facing, and if you've got a party wall or if it's just a cottage, the passageway side is on the south and the window side is on the north, then it's going to let a lot more natural light in and it's going to work a lot better. And that's not necessarily thought of. It's always, and the mindset is, and it should be from a family home point of view when you've got a much bigger frontage or a much bigger rear, that you want that north facing rear. But with different types of property, different orientations can work better.
You're absolutely right. But sometimes, I guess, it's how do you get that light in? Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard. And I think it's just considering it. I think it does play a lot into the Melbourne market in those winters when you do buy something that is dark and cold, or it's got like privacy problems or etc. But access to parkland in the village, I think often people will forget about those things. They really can make a part of a suburb much more livable, right? And walk the dog and pop into the cafe. And so I think they're great points.
And it became even more apparent during the pandemic when you were allowed to go outside for your 1 hour walk, and to be able to go to the coffee shop and grab a coffee and then to walk the dog in a local park and be able to see people. And that's what it became more apparent that having access to those types of services was really important to people.
Jarrod, great to have you on, and thanks for working with all our clients over the years. If people want to get in contact, you can go to Wakelin's, put a link in the show notes, and yeah, really appreciate your time today.
Always love having a chat. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks so much for listening today. We hope you got lots of value out of it. If you'd like to speak to our guest today, there's links in the show notes on how you can get in contact. And if you're buying your first home, upgrading, renovating, or need any finance-related queries, obviously we'd love to help. There's links in the show notes to us as a mortgage broker, and we look forward to next week's episode.